Hey guys, tonight we drift far from the beaten track, past safari jeeps, past cruise liners hugging the coast, past even the boldest tourist's GPS signal, into the soft, forgotten swamps of ancient East Africa. You arrive in Rhapta. Well, supposedly. It's hard to say for sure because even now, no one agrees exactly where Rhapta ever was. But that's part of the charm, isn't it? The sky above is bruised violet, the Indian Ocean hisses in rhythm, and the humid air wraps around your skin like a sleepy python. You're standing at what was once considered the last marketplace on Earth. Roman cartographers labeled this stretch of Africa as beyond understanding. You don't blame them. It smells like wet bark, roasting fish, and some spice you can't quite name. Welcome. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from somewhere special, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far this little storytelling ship sails. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge toward the tree line, where tangled mangroves cling to murky water like gossip to a small town. Somewhere nearby, a bird that sounds like a squeaky hinge calls out and startles a crab into the underbrush. You step over a smooth shell, once bartered for a bolt of cloth, and pause. Rhapta. The name appears in a handful of ancient texts, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, Claudius Ptolemy's maps, and, if you squint, one or two mid-century scholars' wild guesses. It's described as a thriving port on the coast of Azania, possibly modern-day Tanzania. But the deeper you wade into its story, the more you realize how wonderfully blurry the outlines are. Imagine this. You're a Roman trader on a boat held together by stitched planks and salty hope. You've been sailing for weeks, past Arabia, down the Red Sea, hugging the coast like a nervous swimmer. Finally, you arrive at Rhapta, where the huts are low and clustered, the palms sway lazily, and the marketplace murmurs with languages you barely recognize. No temples, no aqueducts, just trade. One Roman scribe breathlessly noted that the people here were of great stature and behavior like Arabians. Sure, okay. That's about as helpful as describing New Yorkers as kinda like people from Mars but louder. You'll find that ancient records weren't exactly Yelp reviews. Still, you wander into town, or what passes for it. The streets aren't paved, but they're well worn by bare feet, and children run past you holding carved boats. A woman balances a basket of dried fish on her head and doesn't break stride. Someone's roasting something you hope is a coconut. The air is thick with trade. Rhapta was known for exporting ivory, tortoiseshell, and iron goods. But unlike its shinier cousins, like Egypt or Carthage, Rhapta never became a household name. It didn't leave behind colosseums or scrolls or monuments. It left behind questions, which is exactly what makes it perfect for bedtime. See, historians still argue whether Rhapta was an actual city or more like a loose cluster of trade huts. Some think it was just a seasonal market town that looked bigger in Roman imaginations. Others are convinced it was the ancient capital of a coastal empire we just haven't found yet, kind of like Atlantis, but with fewer conspiracy documentaries. You wander further in, and the ground squishes slightly beneath your sandals. Someone has carved the word tax into a wooden board, but don't worry, this isn't a pop quiz. You're just here to observe and maybe nap. An old man waves you over. He's holding a map made of palm bark, a few ink stains, and mostly wishful thinking. He points to the sea and mutters about currents and monsoons. Traders from Arabia and India used to time their voyages carefully, riding the monsoon winds down to Rhapta and back up again months later. Miss your window, and you were stuck eating boiled clams with the locals for half a year. That's probably how coconut taxes became a thing. You'll hear more about those later. A goat bleats nearby. You'd be surprised how many trade negotiations in history were interrupted by goats. Some things thus never change. As the sun sinks lower, the town softens. Smoke curls from cooking fires. A few kids gather to watch a lizard stalk a beetle. You sit near a stump that might have once been a merchant's stall and think, there's something oddly comforting about this place. You don't need to know exactly where you are to feel that you've arrived. And that's Rhapta for you, not a glittering kingdom, not a carved empire in stone, just a forgotten crossroad where worlds brushed fingertips and whispered trade secrets in the sea-salted dusk. You wake, or maybe just shift slightly, to the rhythmic slap of tide against canoe. The mangroves glisten with dew. Rhapta is stirring now, not with the clamor of carriages or horns, but with the rustle of woven mats, the hollow thud of iron tools, and the low hum of bargaining that never really stopped from the night before. You rise and begin walking inland, though inland is a generous term. The truth is, Rhapta doesn't so much rise from the coast as it slowly dries out from the sea. The land is flat, salty, and just barely not underwater. You imagine half the town had webbed feet. The air smells like charcoal and fermented fish. Delicious as if you're a bird. In these early years, Rhapta was not the kind of city that impressed through scale. It didn't tower. It didn't glitter. But it grew, quietly, steadily, like mold on a treasure map. A simple gathering point of traders and coastal settlers, perhaps Bantu-speaking fishermen or inland ironworkers, became a magnet for boats from all directions. Historians still debate whether this rise was intentional or just the chaotic result of good geography and oceanic coincidence. Some think Rhapta was always meant to be a city, its location chosen for the confluence of tides and trade. Others believe it simply happened, like how a food truck park evolves into a neighborhood hangout without anyone planning it. You pass a small forge, little more than a sunken pit and some glowing embers, but the young boy hammering away seems confident in what he's doing. Iron tools were one of Rhapta's biggest exports, often traded for Indian cloth, Arabian beads, or Roman coins. Coins that were promptly melted down because, let's face it, metal was more useful than Caesar's face. You pause at the edge of a large open area. It's not a plaza. Rhapta had no marble squares or amphitheaters, but it's clearly the town's pulsing heart. Stalls made of plaited reeds lean under the weight of clay jars, animal hides, woven baskets, and, yes, coconuts. We'll get there. For now, enjoy the oddly hypnotic sound of two men arguing over the price of a single giraffe tail. They speak Swahili, or a precursor of it. You pick up a few words: nyama, meat; chuma, iron; bay, price. The rest sounds like rain falling sideways, but gestures do most of the work. One man offers a pile of beads. The other raises a skeptical eyebrow so high you worry it might detach and float away. Here's something odd. Rhapta, for all its bustle, left almost no written records. No scrolls, no stone carvings, not even a smug little diary by a bored noble. Everything we know comes from outside accounts. most famously the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a Greek travelogue from the 1st century CE. It describes Rhapta as the last market of Azania, known for iron, ivory, and being just far enough away to be thrilling. You think of it like the final outpost in a video game map, not flashy, but full of potential side quests. There's a rumor, just a whisper, that Rhapta had something like a governing council, perhaps elders, maybe a chief, maybe a tax collector who definitely took his job too seriously. And maybe that's why Rhapta grew, not because it wanted to be a city, but because someone realized that if you planted just enough rules around the chaos, it could become profitable, or at least survivable. You watch as a young woman rinses fabric in a muddy stream and hangs it between two sticks to dry. It's dyed in soft reds and deep indigos, colors not native to the area. Imported, most likely. Imagine carrying rolls of dyed cloth across seas just to make sure your local fashion stood out. Across the clearing, two boys kick around a ball made of bundled roots and twine. They shout in rhythm, their bare feet smacking the earth with the practiced grace of children everywhere. You realize suddenly how little we know of Rhapta's daily life. No poems, no myths, just artifacts and silence. But silence can be wonderfully loud if you listen right. A man walks by with a chicken under one arm and a bundle of palm leaves in the other. He stops, grins, and offers you a coconut. It's still green. You thank him with a nod, pop a straw through the soft top, and take a sip. It tastes like sunrise, cool, slightly sour, with a whisper of brine. This is what Rhapta became, a city by accumulation. People, things, language, flavors. Nobody planted a flag. Nobody said, "Here begins Rhapta." It just happened. And before long, it had outgrown its own beginnings. Later, much later, European explorers would look for cities with gates and spires and call this coast primitive when they found none. But they missed the quiet genius of a place like this, how it could grow from the swamp without ever pretending to conquer it. You lie down beside a clump of coastal grass, soft as moss, and watch the silhouettes of palm trees sway against the fading sky. Rhapta doesn't need to shout. It hums. And in that hum, a city rises. So you're sipping that coconut, mildly chilled by coastal breezes, and feeling rather smug about blending in when something curious happens. A man in a woven robe approaches, ledger tucked under one arm, eyes squinting as if appraising not your soul, but your fruit. He points at your coconut, then at you, then back at your coconut, and in a calm, bureaucratic tone, says something like, "Tax." You've just met Rhapta's most feared figure, the coconut collector. See, in Rhapta, trade wasn't just casual barter under banana leaves. It had structure. Maybe not Roman Senate structure, but enough that coconuts, those humble, hairy little currency cousins, were important enough to be taxed, and not lightly. Historians still argue whether the so-called coconut tax was symbolic, economic, or just the result of some overachieving official desperate to invent job security. One theory is that coconuts were used as standardized trade markers like natural coinage. Another suggests they were taxed not for their value, but for what they represented: access to prime land, water rights, or trade participation. Either way, you've been taxed, and for a fruit you didn't even pick yourself. You hand over a second coconut, fortunately gifted by your previous acquaintance, and the collector nods solemnly. Then he dips a stick into an ink pot made from a polished gourd and swipes a line onto a nearby palm frond. Tax paid, you are free to roam. Now, this isn't your typical government revenue model. There's no treasury building, no receipts. The system, as far as you can tell, is more vibe based than ledger based, but it works, at least for now. As you walk through the coconut grove, you spot curious evidence that this taxation system has been around longer than expected. A ring of carved stones surrounds a cluster of the tallest palms, almost like a shrine or marker. At the base of one tree, someone has scratched tally marks. Could be harvest counts or unpaid dues. Quirky tidbit of the day? There's an oral story, still whispered among some coastal elders, that Rhapta's coconut tax exempted any tree struck by lightning. Divine property, they called it. You'd think that would make people nervous about sitting under trees in storms. It didn't. It made them hopeful. But taxes weren't just levied on coconuts. You hear about iron tariffs, shell quotas, and the infamous boat space fee, a kind of rental charge based on how wide your dhows bottom was. It's unclear whether the goal was to fund infrastructure or just support a particularly picky dockmaster with a measuring rope. As you watch one merchant argue over how many coconuts count as a fair toll for unloading a crate of salt, you realize something simple but oddly profound. Rhapta wasn't lawless. It was just informal in all the formal ways. Historians still debate whether Rhapta had an organized state or a loose council of elder merchants. The Periplus calls its chief the ruler of the district of Azania, but that might have been like calling your HOA president king of all suburbs. Titles floated, but power was practical. There's a peculiar sense of governance here, not just in tax enforcement, but in how disputes are settled. You sit near a fire pit where two fishermen present their case to a gray-haired woman who listens, chews calmly on a sliver of sugarcane, then nods once. One man sighs and hands over a basket of smoked eel. Decision rendered, case closed. You wonder if she taxes coconuts too. Probably. Let's zoom out for a moment. Why coconuts? Well, aside from being everywhere, coconuts were useful. The water refreshed travelers, the meat fed workers, the husks became rope, the shells became bowls. Taxing coconuts was like taxing water bottles and lunchboxes and Tupperware all at once. Logical in its own delicious way. And it wasn't without consequence. Miss your coconut payments, and you might find your stall reorganized. Not looted, just conveniently relocated behind the outhouse. You'd be amazed how effective mild administrative inconvenience can be. There's another theory, that the coconut tax evolved from a social practice. That is, instead of a hard law, it was a ritual of respect, a way to show you belonged to the rhythm of Rhapta. Pay the tax, and you weren't just trading, you were participating in the civic heartbeat. You were part of the town's great Chewy center. This would explain why even non-locals observed the custom. A sailor from Gujarat sets down his bag, peels a coconut, and places it beside a small totem before doing business. No one forces him. It's just the done thing. You're dozing slightly beneath a palm now, the sun filtering through fronds like sleepy confetti. A boy walks past singing a tune with the word karanga, possibly a reference to both coconuts and jokes. The line blurs easily here. As the day drifts on, you start noticing the economics of everything. The woman braiding palm leaves by the river is likely making roof thatch for a trader. The elderly man carving teeth into fish bones might be prepping a primitive spearhead to be swapped for dried mango. Even your borrowed seat, A smooth rock half sunk into the ground probably had a function, maybe a watchstone for counting boats. Everything in Rhapta has a purpose. Everything feeds the rhythm, even taxes, even coconuts, especially coconuts. You're starting to understand Rhapta, not through documents or grand architecture, but through small patterns, like how everyone seems to know whose Tao is whose, or how someone always shows up with roasted fish just when you start thinking about lunch. You make your way toward the harbor, or at least the general squishy place, where the land meets the sea in a patchwork of docks, mud, and half-sunken planks. The smell hits you first: salt, fish oil, and wet rope. Then the sound: hollow thunks, creaking wood, and the rhythmic slap of waves against boat hulls sewn together like patchwork quilts. Yes, sewn together. The boats here are not nailed or glued. They are stitched, plank to plank, with palm fiber cordage soaked in resin. It looks delicate, like a giant leather wallet turned inside out. But these things are shockingly seaworthy. They've crossed the Indian Ocean, after all, sometimes twice a year. You're invited aboard one such vessel, the Uhuru, which rocks gently as you step on deck. It smells like sun-dried sardines and optimism. The crew is mostly barefoot and casually multilingual, switching between early Swahili, Arabic, and something that sounds suspiciously like song lyrics. The captain, whose beard appears to double as a wind gauge, shows you around. He points to jars of cinnamon bark, crates of iron tools, a stack of textiles that might have come from Gujarat, and a small clay jar of perfume, sealed with wax and mystery. Trade is alive and pungent. Here's your mainstream historical fact. These sewn plank boats are mentioned in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, described as local vessels built without nails, using ropes made of coconut fibers. Historians note their similarities to Omani and Yemeni ship designs. They may have been ancestral cousins of the Indian Ocean dhow, evolved through centuries of maritime tinkering. Then there's the fringe tidbit. Some fringe theorists claim that these boats are so old they predate the Nile's earliest reed craft. One especially optimistic sailor insists his ancestors used these boats to chase the moon and catch it once, but let it go because it was too sour. You lean against the mast as the boat drifts a little offshore. Other vessels bob around you like sleepy ducks, each with its own peculiar cargo: bundles of iron, pots of honey, dried sea cucumbers, surprisingly lucrative, and an alarming number of bird feathers. But it's not just goods that move, it's gossip. The deck buzzes with voices, traders talking about a Roman man with gold in his teeth who came looking for spices but couldn't tell cinnamon from tree bark. One sailor insists he saw a Chinese monk pass through last season. Another claims his cousin once met Alexander the Great, though the math is sketchy. You float, so half listening, letting the stories layer themselves over the rhythm of the waves. Rhapta, you realize, is less a city and more a network, a pulsing node in a web of commerce, hearsay, and gentle bribery. And boats are its nervous system. As the sun rises higher, you're offered tea from a bronze kettle suspended above a charcoal pit. It's strong, gritty, and probably illegal in 3 empires. You sip anyway. Suddenly, there's a commotion near the shore. A new boat is docking, sleek, painted with faded symbols, and loaded with what looks like sugarcane, bronze bells, and crates of dates. An Omani crew, judging by the headscarves and confident swagger. The harbor buzzes. New stories, new spices, new rates of coconut taxation. And with the arrivals come the whispers. You overhear one trader mention a Roman shipwreck further south, its hull pierced by coral. Another talks about a disease spreading inland, carried by bad wind or bad goats, depending on who you ask. One man, half drunk and fully sunburnt, claims Rhapta will soon be swallowed by the sea because the mangroves are angry. You watch the mangroves, unmoved. But here's a real scholarly puzzle. How did Rhapta communicate with other ports? There's no written evidence of postal systems, no known script. Did they memorize trade routes, use carved tokens, paint messages on fish, and hope for the best? Historians still argue whether these seafarers had a true nautical map culture or just an uncanny sense of direction. Some believe they navigated by the stars. Others say they followed bird migrations or water temperature. One cheerful local simply says, "We ask the wind." You start to believe him. By late afternoon, the boats begin to rest. Sails are furled, goods are unloaded, ropes are coiled in concentric circles like ancient crop fields. A child draws shapes in the sand with a stick. Triangles, swirls, something that looks like a lion with a hat. You wonder if it's a code. Probably not, but maybe. You disembark, feet squishing into warm mud. A monkey eyes your satchel. You hide your remaining coconut. And as you walk back through the docks, past boats sewn like sandals, listening to tales stretched thinner than their sails, you realize something strange and comforting. Rhapta didn't need walls to feel like a city. Its seams were stitched in people, in tide, in tales traded like currency. Even if you weren't buying, you were part of the story. The sun begins to slump in the sky, casting that syrupy golden light that makes everything, from goats to gossip, look more profound than it probably is. You wander back through town, only now it's not just Rhapta's own people you notice. A handful of bearded men in long robes stand out by the edge of a market tent. They're unmistakably not local, and they're speaking Latin-flavored Greek with the delicate bafflement of men who thought this trip would involve more wine and fewer mosquitoes. Congratulations, you've found the Romans, or more accurately, the Romans found Rhapta. Sort of. You approach cautiously, pretending to admire a basket of dried figs. One Roman, sunburned to the point of becoming an architectural ruin, pulls out a scroll and gestures wildly at a nearby trader. The scroll, from what you can tell, is more decorative than useful. It shows a crude coastline, several animals that are either giraffes or spotted dragons, and a big arrow labeled Spice. This is your mainstream history moment. Around the 1st century CE, Roman and Greco-Egyptian merchants were indeed venturing southward along the East African coast. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a kind of ancient sailor's guidebook, lists Rhapta as the last coastal market, and notes it traded ivory, tortoiseshell, and iron goods. Roman interest was less about colonizing and more about shopping, and Rhapta was the edge of their map, literally and metaphorically. You inch closer, catching fragments of confused trade. One Roman points at an iron spearhead and says, "Is this ceremonial?" The Rhaptan trader looks offended and replies, "No, it's for real elephants." Another Roman, clearly more enterprising, pulls out coins with Emperor Nero's face stamped on them and tries to buy an entire dhow. The sailor laughs so hard he nearly falls into a pile of clamshells. Roman currency wasn't exactly the gold standard here. Metal was useful, sure, but so were coconuts, beads, and in at least one case, unusually obedient goats. But here's the quirky fringe bit. Some believe that Rhapta may have hosted semi-permanent Roman outposts, tiny enclaves of foreign traders who came and just didn't leave. Maybe they married into local families. Maybe they couldn't face the return voyage. Maybe they were trying to figure out how to tax coconuts without losing their minds.